Welcome back to all of our friends out there in the Boss Hole Transformation Nation. You are listening to a TBC flashback from June of 2021. This is within the first year of the Boss Hole Chronicles kicking off, and we're going to go back and listen to a conversation that Sarah and I had with Dr. Kevin Sansberry II. He is the creator and host of the Toxic Leadership podcast. Beyond that, he has amazing content. But one of the things that you'll find out is that his approach to working with organizations really rests in three areas: behavioral science, applied innovation, and systems thinking. And as he says, he works best with leaders and organizations that are ready to think systematically about culture and behavior. We thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. He's still very active in the marketplace, so make sure to check out all the show notes. So let's revisit our conversation with Dr. Kevin Sansberry II. The Boss Hole Chronicles are brought to you by Real Good Ventures, a talent optimization firm helping organizations diagnose their most critical people and execution issues with world-class analytics. Make sure to check out all the resources in the show notes and be sure to follow us and share your feedback. Enjoy today's episode. Kevin, welcome to the Boss Hole Chronicles. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, hey, I'm so excited to be here. And John and Sarah, when y'all reached out, it's just serendipity. You know what I mean? I'm like, yes, more people in the movement. We can get this critical mass. And I just got really excited because we don't talk about the boss holes enough, to be honest. And the more we're able to dedicate time and space to be proactive is why I do the work that I do with the Toxic Leadership podcast and the consulting that I do. So yeah, thank you for the invitation, and I'm happy to be here.
Oh, great. And for our listeners who know that we do reference predictive index and the reference profiles, Dr. Sansberry is a promoter.
You're a very motivating, stimulating communicator, which I've witnessed firsthand. I had an opportunity to listen to your TEDx talk, and that was powerful. The masks we wear in the workplace masquerade. Mm-hmm. So many rich, quick hits in there that we can, as leaders and managers, really start to reflect on and take action on.
I just taught a course like literally 10 minutes ago to an organization, and we talked about motivation, and we talked about what motivates people, right? And so, one of my things, the only thing I would add to that is, as quote unquote in that promoter under the predictive index, I think results are not necessarily my primary goal. It's more relationships. So not necessarily, not necessarily being liked per se, but more so building authentic relationships is kind of my primary thing in anything that I do, because that is my result. So I guess that's kind of how I view it.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. And then I think, first off, I do want to say, the informality is really a thing for me. So yeah, call me Kevin. I really, I really love that it pulled that out, because again, I am really focused on relationships and building up people and getting to know people. And that's where the informality comes in, because language in a way is a key or currency into an in-group and out-group. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times I find that formality actually creates difference. Formality actually points out to people, you don't know these words. You don't know this fancy acronym. Mm-hmm. And so I always strive to lower those barriers to connection by being informal, and not out of a lack of respect or lack of decorum, but more so to let people know, look, regardless of a degree or a job or experience or work, I'm human just like you are. Mm-hmm. Because to be honest, those are the people who I want to serve the most, because they're disenfranchised. People who don't have that formal title or formal authority or what have you. And so, yeah, I use informality a lot, and it may turn people off, but the people that it turns off are the people who typically have the most power. So, that's you know what I mean? And that's cool, because I'm here to, especially with the Toxic Leadership podcast, I'm here to lift up the voices of those who feel voiceless, you know? And so I think the promoter definitely speaks to me and the work that I do and how I do it, because I want to always promote others. That's the way I look at it. And, so I love the PI. The PI was fascinating, because I didn't I didn't think I was a promoter based on like how I defined it in my mind. So like, I'm not like a,
Right.
I'm not a megaphone type of guy. Here, but as I thought more about it intrinsically, it's really interesting. That's a really interesting tool. So I appreciate being able to get that.
Oh, absolutely, and we appreciate your doing it too. And as you mentioned, lifting others up. When I heard the episode of the Toxic Leadership podcast, and just really how you were drawing out those stories from Dr. Meadows, I really just wanted to find out more, Kevin, with your research and the work that you've done. Just kind of going back to a bit of the origin of
Yep.
realizing we've got to help these people come out from underneath toxic leadership. We have to find a way to help these individuals who are toxic find a better way, a better path. So take us back to where you realized I've got something here. I'd like to help people find their voice. What was really kind of the origin of that?
The origin of that actually came from, I was doing research and I really fell in love with psychology. And in particular, I loved abnormal psychology
Mm,
because the notion of abnormality assumed that there was a normal. And I really was interested in like learning more about that. And so I started doing some research early on influence and on decision making. And that also led me to doing research on serial killers and criminality.
mm,
And so I dug deep into that research, and I almost went that route of criminology and applied behavioral analysis, but I pivoted for some reason. Maybe it was creepy doing research for serial killers three in the morning. I don't know, but whatever it was, I pivoted, and I actually got into doing research into leadership
mm,
behaviors because again, if you listen to that implies like influence, decision making, and I got into leadership, right?
right.
What I found very striking was I didn't have to pivot that far because if you look at what's called the dark side of leadership research, you actually get the same traits as serial killers in a way. So I do
Wow.
so it's like very
Wow.
fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so if you look at something called like the dark triad, they talk about narcissism, Machiavellianism,
Right.
corporate psychopathy. And so those are the traits that I do research in academically. And so as I graduated and started getting more into not only academically publishing papers on CEO narcissism or abusive supervision,
Right.
I started bringing it into my work. And most recently, so I started my firm in 2017,
Mhm.
and I did leadership development for folks on a small scale, but because I also had a 9 to 5 job. But then this year, I actually pivoted and I'm now doing my work full time and subsequently launched a Toxic Leadership podcast as a result of that too.
Right.
And so now I get to definitely take, what I've learned in academically and what I've been able to apply as an executive coach. I teach these lessons and actually talk with practitioners so that we can eradicate the toxicity within. And so one important piece to note about construct definition is I don't say people are toxic. I say we all have toxic behaviors.
Right.
And I do that because even people who are like the best leaders may have behaviors that may be toxic, that may be destructive in a
Mhm.
way. You can have a great leader who is a hard driver of results and they micromanage you, but you get paid. So you're like, okay, they're fine. You know what I mean? But that behavior could be detrimental to somebody.
Sure.
And so I have a distinct definition that I don't call people toxic per se. And that also is I also do that because I don't want to have somebody thinking, okay, there's no way out. There's
Oh,
no way to, there's no way to change.
right.
And so I do it that way too, because we have to have compassion for those we are wanting to serve. And I think the toxic leader that has the toxic leadership behavior, they have a role in shifting to make things better too.
Sure.
That's right.
So it's not just
Great.
on the victim. It's not just on the employee. It's not just on the people who are a receipt to change the way you're thinking or something like that. It's on those who are perpetuating harm to
Right.
also shift. But if I was calling people, you're toxic, well, how do you go walk back from that? So
Right.
yeah.
We often say no one's born to be a boss hole. And
Yeah,
and and
yeah,
it's
yeah.
I believe wholeheartedly
Mhm.
that people experience challenge and even our natural behavioral drives can create a true challenge and obstacle for others. So I
Mhm.
just love the way you package that not only do leaders have the potential to be toxic, but they do hold the responsibility. They share the burden and hold most of that responsibility for restoring themselves, being
Sure.
less toxic, if
Yeah,
you will.
yeah.
Kevin, I the word toxic jumps out at me, and also the word victim, because when you think about the impact that poor leadership, boss holes, toxic leadership have, not only in the individuals but also the organization, I oftentimes wonder what is its origin. So, does a toxic leader have they learned these things? Do they have sort of a twisted? I'm kind of going back to the serial
Source.
killer sort of thing. Well, and by the way, some of the most popular podcasts out there are about serial killers. So you may have just found an intersection between leadership and serial killers
Of course.
that might have a new niche in the podcast world. I don't know. But what is your research and what is your work revealed in terms of how toxic leaders come about, and what sort of perpetuates that, and why we have such difficulty eradicating this from our organizations?
So research stream, if you looked at like abusive supervision, for example, which is a construct, some aspects of parenting and childhood trauma can be an antecedent, meaning it could influence, you know what I mean, that to manifest. If you look at something like a behavior that a lot of people view as pretty toxic, is micromanaging. Micromanaging could manifest due to a lack of trust and different things like that. There are also behaviors related to people who are perfectionists and super demanding. There's been research to show that can manifest due to unmet needs somewhere else in their life, and they project it to something they have control over, which is their direct reports and stuff like that. And if you go further down the research, it actually showed, they were like, oh, you can mitigate that by actually physical exercise. So like there's all kind of stuff there. So there are things that, the workplace itself, like the non-participative workplaces that are high in competition for like no reason with each other, like you got that. Those kind of workplaces can breed certain behaviors that allow folks to achieve whatever result the company wants, but not the result as it relates to the relationships internally. And so, you can fight for, we need to get these sales, we need to have all these sales, by the quarter or what have you.
Right.
And regardless of what your personal life is like, regardless of like your work time off and that kind of stuff. And so, your external environment can influence behaviors that are less than optimal or getting to that toxic zone, definitely. But again, some of your past experiences that have been reinforced over time and sometimes rewarded over time, that's how they manifest.
Yeah, I can't help but think too about natural behavioral drives. For different people in the workplace, they're going to need different things. And so using the same approach, a hard driving, a goal-oriented, competitive kind of approach will not work for everybody, even everybody on the sales team. So it's about kind of adapting those expectations and the way in which leaders interface with people. But John, I think that was a really powerful question. And Kevin, your response about childhood trauma and things that we encounter, before we come to the workplace, we can't step over that lightly. And
Absolutely.
It is something that all leaders should kind of evaluate for themselves and definitely seek professional help if, in fact, the feedback they received is that, they're on the toxic level, for sure.
Sure. And it's for the leader to be able to listen to those cues, and for all of us to have the emotional intelligence to be self-aware when things get brought to us.
Yes.
Because this, the toxic leadership in itself has, of course, individual characteristics that you want to look at within a leader. But we have to go deeper and go upstream and look at, let's call it a disease, but look at the entire manifestation itself. So we need to look at the culture. We need to look at the organizational climate. We need to look at the outcomes that it has on business to make this change too. Because if it's just, hey, person, change because it's detrimental, if the environment's not rewarding the change, or if the environment's actually perpetuating that behavior to stay the same, you're going to have a toxic leader. You're going to have a boss hole. That it's just going to breed boss holidity. It's going to be there, So, so we have to be very mindful of not only putting the burden solely on people to change. We have to model that organizationally.
Yes. It's interesting because when we talk about culture or the sort of organizational constructs, or how an organization evolves, we get a lot of executives that say, well, this is the kind of culture we want. Okay, well, you can't artificially create a culture. Your culture is a result of, you look at Sherm's definition, it's a result of how leadership influences and oversees the organization. It's a result. It's not a remedy. So you got to go way back upstream, and you've got to go to those managers and supervisors, make sure we've got the people aligned in the right role, and start at that level. But that's heavy lifting.
Mhm.
That is, and one of the things that I want to hear more from you is you talk about mitigation and the work around that within leadership or managers and supervisors.
Mhm.
Tell us more about that and that kind of work that you're doing.
So some of the work I've started doing, especially as it relates to diversity, equity, inclusion, organizations are doing a lot of that now. My change model that I use looks at mitigation and addresses mitigation by focusing on conditioning. And so what I mean by that is we actually start introspectively because like I said, a lot of these antecedents or factors that breed toxicity could come from our past, could come from what we know or what we think we know of how to lead, stuff like that.
Mhm.
And so I always have people do a lot more introspection up front because I believe if we focus inward, we'll get outward results versus the other way around. And it's not a dichotomy. You do both at the same time. But
Mm.
a lot of organizations, what they do is like, oh, we need to make a new policy or we need to do this thing, but they don't address people's mental models. And so behind closed
Right.
doors, people aren't following whatever policy you wrote in the HR department. They're doing, and when you ask people to describe their organizational culture and climate, they're actually going to not tell you the stuff HR is doing or the stuff you hear at the all staff meeting. What they feel is what they have at their localized culture. And so you have to address the managers at the, introspectively at that level.
Mm.
And so as it relates to mitigation, I do a fair work globally, like global culture, organizational
Mhm.
culture. So I work with HR departments, legal teams, and stuff like that in various firms. But I want to give you a quick data point from some of my research. I did research in my so based on my TED Talk, The Masks We Wear in the Workplace Masquerade, I did research on how often or how likely is somebody gonna mask their values and adopt organizational values they don't believe in. And I did that in the space of a toxic work environment, toxic leadership, right?
Mhm.
What I found was those who had a perception of organizational support actually were more likely to mask their values,
Hmm.
right?
Interesting.
I was
Okay.
wrong. So I hypothesized that they wouldn't. I was like, no, if they have organizational support, people would more likely just be themselves, inclusion, da da da. But I actually found the opposite.
Wow.
And so what that's leading me to believe, or leading me to, I'm gonna do more research, but
Sure.
what that's leading me to go down is, do people want to keep the organizational support so they wear that mask?
Mhm.
Like, they don't wanna lose it now.
Mm.
And so it's like, how can we go upstream organizationally to counteract organizational support being viewed as something you're gonna lose if you be yourself?
Mm.
That's
Wow.
just another thought to think about, right? Another thing I found was people were more likely to not wear their metaphorical mask and be themselves more when they felt like that had organization or coworker support.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Right? So the
Yep.
perception of coworker support, the more likely people felt they had that coworker support, they were like, "You know what? I can be myself."
Mhm.
So what that's telling me is it's not solely the procedures and the policies and this organizational culture, this abstract organizational culture concept that we talk about that's going to get what we want. It's really going to be the level of community. It's going to be the level of critical mass we have here from a people standpoint, so our coworkers. And so what I say by that is that question of coworkers not saying necessarily people at your same level. So that could be managers. You know what I mean? Like their coworker, right? So basically it's
Yeah.
like how we treat each other, not just the policies and procedures and the values we got on the wall and the pretty videos we got. Like all those fanciful, organizational culture things is not the sole driver.
Kevin, I would love to just understand a little bit more about what you mean by organizational support.
hmm So that construct is formally called perception of organizational support.
Mm.
And specifically in my study, I hypothesized that if people felt like the things we do from an organizational culture standpoint, benefit people, I hypothesized that as they see the staff meetings and they see the listening tours and they see the support, and it's great. I just hypothesized that folks would truly be themselves and not feel the need
Yep.
to mask their values. And but that's specifically what I was looking for. And so so that's what it looks at. It just looks at like how people perceive these things that we do in the workplace from a support standpoint. Yeah.
Sure. So things like an engagement survey, and you call them listening sessions, and getting pulse checks, and the way organizations attempt to be responsive to the needs of their employees, the changing needs, that kind of stuff.
I would actually, academically, I would challenge an engagement survey only because one might ask, does the engagement survey itself, based on how it's used, does it support me as an employee? Or is it supporting an organization to have some kind of scorecard and check the box they did an engagement survey? So perception of organization support really goes into how do those things impact people? And you know what I mean? And so are they done in the spirit of centering the needs of the people, or are they done in the spirit of centering the needs of the organization? So engagement, basically what I'm trying to say is an engagement survey could be in that category, but it really depends on the population and how they perceive it.
Yes.
Yep.
Or even how the engagement assessment is actually built. I mean, how it's constructed, because there are thousands of them out there. I mean, we use one in our work, but it's very specific to the manager, and we define engagement as an employee's emotional connection to the organization and its goals.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, if you don't feel that, you are never going to get performance, retention, and things that come with engagement. Something you said, though, that I think is really interesting, and Sarah, I'm going to connect this back to another podcast. You said when they are able to take off that metaphorical mask and be themselves is really when they have support from their colleagues. Is that correct? Is that what it was?
Yeah. As perception of coworker support increased, the likelihood of people not feeling the need to mask up. Yeah.
Okay. Not to mask up. I love that, because we just had Dr. Richard Schell on a podcast from the Wharton School, and his new book called The Conscience Code. He talks about how it can be oppressive in an organization when you have people that are absent of conscience and are compromising their values or core values.
Yes, core values. Yeah.
But when an individual feels like they have a partner in it, or they have somebody with whom they can share that, it totally changes things. Sarah, do you remember when he talked about that?
I do.
That aligns exactly with my findings.
Yep.
So it's the same thing. And Dr. Schell will actually be on the Toxic Leadership podcast as well. And
Nice.
I definitely agree. I don't have to agree. My research agrees. So
Right.
I mean, so like it's what Dr. Schell is stating is proof of what I'm saying in a way.
Right.
That's actually called the buffering hypothesis of coworker support.
Okay.
And so what that means is, and what it looks at is, coworker support may be able to buffer the negative effects of a boss hole, the negative effects of a toxic leader, that has that behavior. And that just tells me where we need to spend more time organizationally.
Right.
Right. And it tells me, how can we not, like, again, engagement surveys and all that kind of stuff are great. But the thing about engagement surveys is, here's where it won't become an organizational support mechanism. If I told you about a boss hole in those culture and climate surveys, engagement surveys, and nobody did anything about it, guess what? It goes out the window. It's not a thing. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. You're absolutely right. Yep.
So we spend time, HR departments and, chief people officers or whomever, that spend time on these organizational support mechanisms, they have a place, but we also have to spend time on coworker support mechanisms concurrently and build that community. Because if we ask for folks to follow like an anti-harassment policy, for example, you're going to get your greatest success when there is modeling and norms that are done on the individual level, not just, do we memorize the policy? No.
Right.
I need to have a culture where people can call out things that don't reach a level of policy, so that we don't even get to the, sexual harassment or discrimination or something like that. I want to have a culture of people working together to create the culture, not just having artifacts as a compliance mechanism. And so that's where I believe, so that's just where I believe the coworker support can actually be. You could turn that into a mechanism of organizational support if you are strategic about it.
Sure.
I love that. And I hope leaders and managers and CEOs and other C-suite people are listening and recognizing that that's a place to direct effort and energy, especially now with this hybrid workforce. Kevin, what are your thoughts about, fostering that level of community because your research shows that the level of community supersedes the perception of organizational support. How do we do that via Zoom and Teams? And I'm in the office on Tuesdays and you're in the office on Wednesdays.
Mm-hmm. Geographic, proximity and working remote does take more work, right? It takes different work, I guess I will say. And so as we think about hyper remote organizations and organizations that have flexible schedules and flexible ways to meet, keep that flexibility.
Right.
But we also need to build in time for flexible informality. And so how are we also going to build in time where it's like, hey, let's have our staff meeting at a park, or let's meet somewhere, just more opportunity to do that too. And I
Right.
think it's kind of like having a long distance relationship. If anybody's ever had one, I've never had one, but I've heard that they take more work for a reason, right?
Right.
And
Right.
so work is a form of a relationship. So it's the same notion you can think about. It takes more work and it just takes different level of engagement due to that lack of geographic proximity. Now, I know one thing about remoteness, some people have their mental model where they're like, oh, we're more profitable and we work better together if we are always together. I challenge that.
Yeah.
Right? So like we have to be able to, I think when you work with people, the more flexible we can be, the more inclusive we can be.
Right.
And so if we need to jump off of our own mental models of that. But yeah, I just think ask people what their preferences are related to engagement in those settings.
Mhm.
And we do our best to create systems to meet those preferences. But we have to ask and we have to have these conversations. And these conversations are better had not through your engagement survey, but through qualitative kind of conversations and lunch and, kind of lunch and learn type of deals where we just have conversation and facilitation and stuff like that. That's where you're going to get that data.
Well, and you're going to need leaders that are hungry for that and understand the value in that. I mean, they are the ones that are seeking that out. And I don't. I mean, I use this whenever I'm doing a keynote or a presentation. I started my first practice back in 1997, and the number one issue that organizations and my clients were experiencing is we're having trouble with our managers. We're not sure that they're equipped, and it's like, oh my gosh, we are still talking about this. Why do we continue to perpetuate this and allow? And I don't think it's an evil plot. I don't think there's anything really behind it. I just think it's a little bit careless. And
It is.
what we say is that there should be a really wide and very well developed pathway for individual contribution in an organization, and a person should be able to see and be guided and coached down that. And then the pathway into leadership and management should be high. The threshold should be higher, and the requirements more significant, because you are in charge. You are responsible for other humans, and we have some clients that absolutely see that, and then others that just say, "Well, you're you're convenient. You've been here longest. Let's put you in management."
Yeah.
And that's where you get boss hole zones or toxic leadership, at its best.
Yeah, and to that point, one of the biggest or one of the most common toxic behaviors that we actually pride a lot of times in society, but we don't do enough to counteract it,
Mhm.
whether, is hubris.
Mm.
Is hubris, right? So if you look at, how people show up, leaders typically are assumed to know the answer and know the way. And hubris is like fed. We feed it.
Yeah.
I think if we did spend a lot more time praising the vulnerability, praising not knowing,
Yes.
praising what you learned versus praising what you know,
Mhm.
you'll start to see C-suites, for example, being open to new ideas, being open to listening to the all up and down the organizational chart.
Yes. And being willing to admit that they are part of the problem.
Sure.
They might be willing to say, gosh, I have perpetuated something that's really unhealthy unknowingly.
And Sarah, that's why, and a lot of times that's why they don't hire us.
Right.
We uncover those kinds of things, and sometimes the truth is hard to hear. And I spent a lot of time working with leaders, C-suite executives, explaining that I lead by vulnerability. So I'm like, oh, here's a mistake I made, or here's something I did that was actually very similar, but here's what I learned from it.
Right.
I share these stories and I share that perspective because I want everybody to know that you might be a CEO, but guess what? You make mistakes. So if we own up, that's the best way to show that vulnerability. And if we're talking about building a anti-boss hole culture that is counteracting toxic leadership,
Yep.
CEO vulnerability and CEO being able to admit fault can transcend the organizational culture and climate.
Oh, yeah.
That
That's
is
well said.
That's
So well said.
huge.
I want to go back for a quick second too. I just keep floating around with this sense of coworker support and
Mhm.
a sense of community. And I do think, your comments about hubris and vulnerability, really letting vulnerability be more the norm, combining that with just spending time together. I mean, you pretty much said, opportunities in an informal way to build relationship. And whether that's at a park or even on a casual Zoom meeting, it's being intentional about seeking fundamental understanding of one another.
Mhm.
And gosh, those aren't hard to do. They don't have cost a big budget. They really just require some self-awareness, some insight, and what a big difference that can make for our outcomes, how we serve our clients. So I love that you connected all those things.
Mhm.
I was also thinking about another one of our guests, Tony Moore. Tony's out of Florida, great guy. What is he? The culture coach or the culture architect?
Yes.
That's right.
The
And
culture architect.
the culture architect. But Kevin, something that you said that made me think about how Tony does his work is he said he meets with a CEO for him to take on any engagement or any work with an organization. He meets with the CEO or the members of the C-suite and say, love the opportunity to work with your organization, but we're going to start here. We're going to start with you.
Mhm.
And if there's any pushback, he says, I'm just not sure I'm the best fit here because if you're not willing to show that, if you're not willing to work on you, then it's not going to work anywhere else. I think that is a great thing. So to your point, we could get kicked out of a C-suite pretty quickly if we're
Mm.
if we're pressing the reality button a little bit too hard. But I don't
Mhm.
think that's a bad thing these days.
No, not at all. And, there's actually research called emotional contagion that actually looks at the fact of, your CEO and your C-suites, how they show up emotionally transcends the organization negatively or positively or neutrally.
Yes.
And
Right.
so the reality that, again, a lot of C-suites have that hubris and, oh, we're not the problem. In reality, some C-suites may not be the catalyst to a lot of the boss hole or toxicity, but the
Hmm.
fact that we have boss holes and toxicity is the problem.
That's
Yes.
right.
Right? And so you can be complicit, but not an actor, in the negativity, but being complicit is you might as well be.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so I totally agree with the culture architect there. I love that approach because as a practitioner and consultant, why waste my time
Yep.
if you're not gonna have the impact as necessary? Yep.
I think
Absolutely.
it was Dr. Travis Bradberry, who's kind of an EQ guru,
Mhm.
among other really good authors. He indicated research that he did that demonstrated that the higher you go in an organization, the lower the
Lower
level of emotional intelligence.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that could be true. And even if we just looked at self-awareness, that's where the complicity comes in.
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
it's not enough not to know yourself and
Sure.
how you're engaging with this. I do have a question, Kevin.
Ooh,
And
hold on. I mean, let me make a statement real quick.
oh, please.
So before we jump into the question, I wanna ask a question about what you just said. So I'm familiar with that research, and it makes me wonder, some of those people in the C-suite were individual contributors. They were in different parts of that little chart, right? So
Yes.
do people magically lose their EQ? Do they magically lose their EQ? Or does the expectations and how we've crafted roles not perpetuate EQ to be important?
It's a great
Ooh,
question. That is a great
wow.
point. Yep.
So
That might
Yep.
be the subject of my dissertation if I ever
there you
do
go.
that. That is so good. Okay, so you ready for the question?
Yes, yes.
Have you ever been a boss hole?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
Yes.
and maybe you have a good boss hole story, either you
Yeah.
or someone you worked for.
No, I'll share. So and this is a story of growth. And so I was unknowingly a boss hole early part of my leadership career where I was the leader who became a leader based on my ability to interact with people,
Hmm.
but also based on my skill and ability to create new products and do new things and things like that. the lesson I didn't learn as I transitioned into a leader at the time was delegation is actually a thing. You should do that. Like that should be a thing, right?
It's a good thing. Yeah.
That's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. That doesn't make you bad. I got a 360, and 360s are awesome. And I wasn't even nervous. I was ready for it, whatever. And it was actually really good. But what stuck out to me was all my direct reports talked about, well, we'd love for you to delegate more.
Mm.
And it wasn't from like, hey, you're a boss hole. I'm calling myself a boss hole, but it was more so, hey, we believe in our mission and we want to help. We want to be a part of this too. We want to be more a part of it, more accountable and all that kind of stuff. And that hit me like a ton of bricks. And I wasn't like mad. I was actually like, oh wow. So I'm like thinking about like, okay, what can I do better?
Mm.
And ever since then, literally, that's like kind of how I lead. I spend a lot more time learning more about what people want to do in their growth, and I'm actually became like a really great delegator, and that's based on feedback from direct reports or what have you. And but I look back and I'm like, man, I was such a boss hole. Because I'm like, oh my god, because now as I grew, I'm like, oh my gosh, of course, delegating. I teach delegation courses, like
right, exactly.
yeah. So like, it's obvious now, but beforehand, probably about 10 years ago, it didn't even hit me because I was rewarded and praised for what I know and what I do, not necessarily how I lead.
Right.
And so it took me a while to understand the difference when you flip over from individual contributor to being a leader or what have you in the leadership line.
Right.
And so I became like an assistant vice president level, and I had a larger team than even I had at that time. And literally one of my what's the word I'm looking for? Principles of how I lead was however anybody needed to meet with me as a leader, I made that time for them.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very inclusive and very differentiated between the person. And so not only did I delegate, but if somebody needed to meet with me twice a week, 3 times a week, every day, every 2 weeks, whatever your preference was, I met that preference. And that's how I led from then on. Very equitably and very inclusive based on the individual's needs. But that taught me a very valuable lesson early in my leadership career.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
Well, and your promoter pattern has with it a low drive for formality. So you're flexible, spontaneous. You don't necessarily want to attend to the details.
Mm-hmm.
So I love the connection you made about, empowering others to manage the details. They want to help. They want to grow. That's
was
the number one. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
That's like the light went off right there. I was like, oh my God.
Yeah, you saying that is like fascinating because I'm like that. I actually didn't even know the damage it was doing to me by not delegating. Because to your point, Sarah, I really appreciate you lifting that up. I like there were details I was having to deal with day in, day out that I actually, to be honest, I should have delegated. It wasn't really my role to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
But it allowed people who have that higher drive for details, it allowed them to get in their wheelhouse.
Yep.
And it allowed me to stay big picture.
Yeah.
And I never thought about it like that.
Well,
It's like
and
your
I think
superpower.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it only reinforces when we're telling organizations that as you put somebody on that pathway to leadership or management, you have to equip them. You have to prepare them for it. Don't just drop them in.
Yeah.
And part of that is understanding self-awareness, reality testing, learning the skills of delegation and empowerment. Those are I never had them when I got into it, and I came home exhausted. And it was like, why don't you just, somebody said to me, why are you doing this stuff? Why are you not delegating? I totally get that.
Mm-hmm.
But so Kevin, this is, I tell you what, this is just absolutely awesome. And I feel like we need a part 2 at some point. Maybe
I do
reconvene because we would love to hear more about your research and the work that you're doing. But for all of our listeners, get into the show notes, check out, Kevin's information. We'll post up his LinkedIn information, a link to the Toxic Leadership podcast. But what's on the horizon for you relative to the podcast, sort of your full-on consulting practice? Just give our listeners a sense of that.
Yeah. So I've expanded my work, and I'm currently, I've built a model related to some of the DE&I work that I've been doing for years. But I created a model that actually connects to the toxic to transformational work that I do.
Nice.
And it all connects together. And I'm working on formalizing that and expanding that into organizations. And so I already work with 3 organizations that I'm already having they're prototyping, and everything's working out just fine and working on refinement. I'm also going to be doing academic literature into that soon as well. Second, definitely check out the podcast. One of the things related to the work that I do on the podcast that's actually been really fascinating is I'm doing a lot more keynotes, and I'm having a lot more conversations with folks about these aspects formally in the workplace setting. And so I'm always open to, doing talks and doing keynotes related to these topics, because as my PI promoter, indicates, I'm very open to different ideas, and I'm very open to just chatting with you informally. So I'm always looking for opportunity to come in and help people, and again, be the promoter for the voices of the voiceless. So
Well, I think all listeners have to do is go check out your TED Talk. If they just Google your name,
yes,
Dr. Kevin Sansberry II, they'll find a host of connections, your LinkedIn profile. But the TED Talk helps us understand, too, what a dynamic speaker you are.
Hey,
So
thank you.
shout out for that.
Well, Kevin, this has been a real gift for our listeners. We appreciate your time, your insights, your expertise, and I do hope this is only the first of many times we get a chance to interact.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bo.
Thank you, Kevin. See you next time.
Thanks very much for checking out this episode of the Boss Hole Chronicles. It was so good to have you here. And if you have your own Boss Hole story that you want to share with the Boss Hole Transformation Nation, just reach out. You can email us at mystory@thebossholechronicles.com. Again, mystory@thebossholechronicles.com. We'll see you next time.